light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. I began my life within a Roman Catholic context, and from there went to Protestant, Pentecostal, Charismatic, Episcopal, Presbyterian, United Methodist, Unitarian Universalist, etc. Wide range of different things. But in any case, the first part of my life was in some form of Christian context. I think I've kind of outgrown every church I've discovered so far in terms of getting a broader and broader idea of God and so forth. It's not so much a concern of mine how one perceives God as that one has some sort of empowering relationship with whatever they understand to be greater than themselves. All of which is just to say, a kind of a lead-in, I suppose. One of the ideas that came up numerous times within that Christian upbringing was the notion of being in the world but not of the world. To first understand what it is we're talking about, I guess, as we say in graduate school, to deconstruct the phrase a little bit, what do we mean by being in the world? To some extent, that would be just our simple, inescapable presence, that we are in fact in the world, that we exist within communal context, whether it's an agrarian farming community or whether it's an urban city community, or whether it's a familial community or a church community or a social club community, that there are relationships that are all around us with which we interact. One could even say the community of the familiar faces that we see each week going through existing in life. The people at the grocery store, the people at the gas station, the people with whom we, at whatever place of employment, when we buy something at a department store, the cashiers there. All of these are people with whom we're interacting. And by having that interaction, there's a sense in which we are in their world. And maybe we don't live completely within their world. If I go shopping at for whatever reason, to look and see what they have, if I go to an upscale store where things are very expensive and there may be nothing there I could afford to buy, the people whom I see there, the cashiers, the sales clerks, and so forth, we have a momentary overlap between our worlds, but we really don't live in the same world, because they will go home perhaps to a much wealthier context than I will. I'll go home to my fixer-upper house and they'll go home to a nice home in the suburbs maybe, or something like that. So there's a sense in which our worlds are quite distinct from each other. There are people who live in racially mixed worlds and people who live in racially homogeneous worlds. People go home to a suburb where all of their neighbors are a particular race, every single one of them. And other people who go home to apartment buildings where there may be 5 different races all living within the same building. Again, these are different kinds of worlds. To live in an apartment building where there may be 5 different races, there is a sense in which you are in the world of that apartment building. But the question of being of it, do you reflect that world? Or is there congruity, is there commonality between you and that world? If, for example, there was someone who grew up in an environment that was racially not mixed, they never saw anyone except members of their own race. I was watching television the other night and they were interviewing the actor Jamie Farr, who I believe he said he was Lebanese, and consequently has a very large nose, because that's one of the physical characteristics. And he said, well, in his neighborhood, everybody had large noses. He didn't think anything of it until he got outside of his neighborhood and started meeting all these people who had small noses. And he thought it was kind of funny that they all had such small noses. And it wasn't a question of value, it was just a question of noticing the difference. In being in those other worlds, though, he, in a sense, found that he was not of that world. And so he had to learn how to relate to people who were different from himself. And that's something that if we venture outside of whatever context in which we were raised, then very likely at some point in life we will all find ourselves in worlds that don't reflect who and what we are or where we came from. When I lived in New York City, I was not of New York City. I was a small town boy from a Germanic farming community in Wisconsin. And so I was in New York City, but I wasn't of New York City, which is where the friends and acquaintances I met there were forever worrying about how I was going to be victimized because I was so naive and so trusting that they were just sure somebody was going to take advantage of that and really hurt me. And it was sweet, it was charming in a way. Thankfully, nothing ever really did happen. Perhaps I'm one of the lucky few, I don't know, but it was easy to see how someone who grew up in that environment would reflect that environment. And even after living in that environment for an entire school year, there were still a whole lot of things about me that did not originate from the environment of New York City, but were clearly from somewhere else. So I was in the world of New York, but not of the world of New York City in particular. Applying that to spiritual, ethical, moral, religious sorts of contexts, when this idea comes of being in the world but not of the world, it's kind of this invitation or challenge even to dare to be different, to dare to march to a different drummer, that even while you are in a particular place, if you're in a European-oriented community for the most part, but you happen to like Asian food, so go ahead and have your Asian food. I don't see how it's going to hurt anybody. But that's a contrast where you're making a choice to do something differently for whatever reason, just because you like it, or maybe there is a bigger reason. There's a sense, I suppose, in which one could say that when the racial integration of professional baseball first happened, and now if I get this wrong, everyone's going to tell me. What I'm remembering is Jackie Robinson was the first black baseball player. And in a Broadway play I saw about that whole transition, I think it was a Broadway play simply called The First. And there was a wonderful scene in there where somebody was arguing with the coach who had decided to bring Jackie Robinson in because he was so good as a baseball player. And the person said, well, you have to do these things gradually. And the coach basically responded, well, one was about as gradual as I could manage. To do one at a time. Could you do less than one? Do you have, I don't know. I'm not sure what alternative the guy was thinking of, but it was an amusing sort of common sense sort of thing. Because clearly the coach didn't really care one way or the other what somebody's race was. He wanted a good baseball player, and Jackie Robinson was a good baseball player. So, but coming back to each of us in our respective lives, that there are times where we can be silent and blend in because it would just be too unpleasant or uncomfortable, or it would ruffle somebody's feathers, or it would make somebody else feel uncomfortable if they knew that, in fact, there wasn't 100% agreement in the room, that there may be both, heaven forbid, Democrats and Republicans in the same room. Oh my God. And lo and behold, when that sort of situation happens, to the best of my knowledge, the room has never burst into flames. it's really not the problem some people make it out to be, to the extent that we don't make it a problem. But there is something about having that contrasting voice and perspective there that could be interpreted as a valuable resource if we're willing to listen and open up to it. That instead of saying, oh my God, you don't fit in, to instead say, oh really? What does it look like from your perspective? Or how would you solve this problem? This is what somebody else has suggested, but how would you do it? And once you have diversity going, that one person says, let's solve the problem this way, and the other person says, we could solve it this way, and somebody else says, well, we could also solve it this way. It seemed to me growing up that there are 100 ways to do everything. The question is simply deciding upon which one you're going to choose and deciding upon one that is actually effective and paying attention to whether or not it's effective. And having the courage, well, this kind of goes back to a witticism that came to mind a number of years ago as I was, each month I put together a monthly newsletter called Sisterhood's Perspective. And the past issues are available within my website at sisterhood.com for those who have internet access. But there was one particular, in each newsletter, I try to come up with one little one-sentence soundbite so that if people remember nothing else from this newsletter, here's one sentence of a particular idea that maybe they can ponder for a while and get something good out of it. Well, as I was trying to come up with some new little sound bites for my newsletters, a phrase came to mind, I'm not sure from where, that simply said, it all begins with finding the courage to stand alone. And of course, in my graduate school thinking, critical thinking and such, critical thinking meaning not in the sense of tearing it down, but of carefully taking apart and figuring out what the pieces and the relationships are. Critical thinking is not about being critical, but it's about thinking critically, thinking the different ways that something could be evaluated. And so it all begins with finding the courage to stand alone. First of all, what is it? What is it that begins? And sometimes I can honestly say I don't know. But there was some sense, even as I wrote it the first time, that the it to which this phrase refers is something specifically good. That in order for professional baseball to be integrated, Jackie Robinson had to be willing to be the first, to be the one, to be willing to stand alone as the only black man in this white baseball team. And in that, even when he wasn't intending to, just by the mere fact of his presence, to begin to teach people what an integrated baseball team would be like. But it all began with someone finding the courage to stand alone and say, yes, I'll be the first. Yes, I'll stand up and do it. When nobody else will, when nobody else will speak up, I will stand up and do it. And how many times throughout history, by one person being willing to stand up and say, I'll do it, that the tide begins to turn. Because as soon as one person does it, then there's somebody else who doesn't have to be the only one, and so they find it a little bit easier to join that first person. And then another, until it seems like there are so many people doing it that one wonders why it was ever a problem in the first place. Yeah, there was a point at which, I don't mean to keep coming back to racial conflicts of history, but I guess they're the most easily available examples at the moment. But Rosa Parks being the one to sit down on the bus and say, no, I'm not moving. Being willing to stand alone for that moment in order to start a work, but start a change, a work of a work of movement toward racial equality. But of course, in that moment, she couldn't have known that anybody would follow. She couldn't have known that a movement would in fact be started by it. She was simply being in that moment, doing what she could as a single individual and finding the courage to stand alone. Being in a world, but not of it. Being in a world where discrimination was the norm, but she chose not to be of it. She chose to go with her own integrity and to be her own person, and to shrug off whatever peer pressure or governmental pressure or legal pressure anyone wanted to place upon her, and to stand in her integrity. To be in the world but not of it. And by not being of it, ultimately, in her case, the world changed. And we never know when we might be the one, like Rosa Parks, who initiates the change that humanity desperately needs. I say desperately needs because there were all sorts of growth and collaboration and harmony and ways of exchanging ideas and of developing ourselves that were not possible until we could get past this question of, yes, but what race are you? And, well, what does race have to do with riding on a bus? You know, it has to do with whether you pay the fare and sit on the seat and get off at your stop. You know, whether the bus driver drives the correct route. It has nothing to do with race. You know, in the present time, there's different places around the world where, and within many religious contexts, where the definition of marriage is being argued. Well, what does gender really have to do with marriage? Marriage is a matter of commitment, a matter of supportive relationship. It may or may not involve children. There are many opposite-sex couples who are choosing not to have children, furthering the definition of marriage and being a couple as being distinct from whether or not it has anything to do with children. So if it doesn't have anything to do with children, if we're now faced with a marriage definition, ultimately it's about rights and privileges, it's about tax laws and visitation rights, it's about inheritance laws, it's about property ownership, all sorts of things upon which gender has no bearing whatsoever. And if we allow that, if we allow each matter to be concerned only with what it needs to be concerned with, if we are willing to find the courage to stand alone, if we are willing to be in the world but not of it, we give the world the opportunity to become something else, to become better than it has been. In amongst all of that, of course, we come back to this basic idea that everything begins with a thought. Everything begins with a dream. You know, Martin Luther King said, "I have a dream." And there are people who, from every race, Latinos and Asians and every continent on the planet, who have had dreams, who have had aspirations, who have created beautiful things. First they had to have the dream. Then they had to have the willingness to put it out where it could be shared, to work toward manifesting it, toward converting it from something intangible to something tangible. There was a time at which the Michelangelo's David did not exist. There was a time at which the Great Wall of China did not exist. There was a time at which the Eiffel Tower did not exist. When the Statue of Liberty was simply an idea in an artist's mind. And then they had to figure out, okay, so if we were going to build this thing that I've just imagined, what would it take? And again and again and again, I find it's not about saying what's possible or impossible, but simply about asking, what would it take? And to me, my suggestion is that all of the best works of humanity, individually and collectively, the best works of individuals and the best works of community, always require truth and honesty. That anything that has involved dishonesty, that has involved treachery, that has involved creating something at the expense of someone else, in a way that, in a sense, in a metaphorical sense, leaves the work soaked with blood. That this was built by the blood of whatever people. All the best works, would not abide that. Those that have, to my understanding, are crumbling. They're revered in a sense as great accomplishments, like the pyramids being built supposedly with slave labor, southern plantations in the United States, great huge works of architecture and so forth, again built with slave labor. There's something about it that, in my opinion, perhaps, never quite escapes from its tragic roots. But the things that are most beautiful, that we cherish, for me, the Statue of Liberty. I'm sure for other people they would name 1,000 other different things. The Redwood Forest. These are natural wonders. It's when we put our greatest truth and our greatest integrity into it that it becomes the least amount of struggle to inspire others to join and to move humanity in that positive direction. When there is oppression and deceit, and when it's not about truth or freedom or love or loyalty or virtue, but when it's about greed and avarice and tyranny, those are the things that get displaced and drummed out of history and remembered only in the most negative ways, so that we can be sure, or we can hope to be sure, that we don't make that mistake again. A friend and I, quite a number of years ago, visited the Nazi concentration camp of Dachau in the area of Munich, Germany. And I'd always heard from people who visited concentration camps of how depressing they were and how dark and dreary and how, it was so awful. And so I was kind of bracing myself for that as we arrived at Dachau. But it was quite the opposite for me, and that was a little bewildering. Because first of all, there were only two or three cars parked outside the entrance. And next to those 2 or 3 cars were about 15 school buses. And everywhere we went inside, there were high school kids all over the place, examining this place and checking it out and seeing what it looked like and what was the history here. And then we went eventually to the administration building, where a sort of museum had been set up. And it was interesting to note that what attracted the students' attention most was the guest book, where they were going through page by page, line by line, seeing who had been there, who had visited the camp, who had signed the book, and what they had written about their, next to their name, where they signed the guest book. For myself, as we went around the camp, because there were such harsh living conditions immediately after World War II, all of the old buildings had been torn down and used for firewood, if I understand correctly. So the original buildings weren't there. It was just a big bare field. But as we followed this walking path around the circumference that kind of been laid out so that people could see the different areas, every 50 feet, it seemed, was another memorial. The Protestant memorial, the Jewish memorial, the Catholic memorial, the artistic memorial, the GLBT memorial. The place was so inundated with memorials and artistic works. And on the back side of Dachau, there was even a gate that led into a convent for a convent of nuns who had defined as their spiritual purpose to position themselves at Dachau and pray for the healing of the nation, of the people, of everyone affected by it, of the spiritual and emotional and psychological undoing of all the evil that had happened there. And I mean, that was their basic reason for existence, is their daily duty was to pray for healing related to the concentration camp of Dachau. And so yes, I saw the crematorium, and I saw the showers, and thinking of the horrible things that happened there, and they were tragic, horrible things, of a time of great psychological confusion on a societal level. That there was insanity run amok in ways that have happened very few times, or relatively few times throughout human history. Certainly there have been other times, unfortunately, but somehow all of that paled in comparison to the outpouring of wisdom and love with which everybody who could had touched the space. All that being said, I'm sure that people will continue to go there and have each person have their own experience according to whatever the experience was.